We're back with the third installment of the Red Line Report webcast, and this time out we would like to focus a little of attention and focus the spotlight on some players that we feel are some of the more undervalued prospects in this year's draft. We'll start out in the Ontario Hockey League and talk a little bit about Alex Hutchings, who is a really speedy and skilled winger, very intelligent, but he's been undervalued a little bit and underrated because he's not a particularly big guy, doesn't have much physical presence out there, but we really love at Red Line Report the way he plays the game, the way he anticipates where the puck is going, and is always one step ahead of the defense. He gets the puck to the net, and he has a way of picking up points in even difficult situations, has a way of winning those battles for loose pucks even against much bigger and more physical defensemen. So Alex Hutchings, we think, is a player who is not getting his due so far this year. Also talk about a couple of kids in Brampton. Big physical defenseman Matt Clark. He's a big, baggage smashing defenseman. His footwork isn't the greatest, but you can't teach 6'3", 215 with a mean, nasty, snarling attitude out there. Clark is the kind of guy who takes care of his own end first and really clears the front of the net very well and wins all those battles down along the walls. Very difficult in one-on-one situations. So I think Matt Clark is a guy that has been somewhat overlooked in the OHL this year. But as we get into the playoffs here, and Brampton has performed very well here in the first round of the playoffs, and Clark has been one of the reasons for that. He's a good shutdown physical presence along the blue line. And then again, his teammate Matt Duchene. Now, it may seem odd to say that Matt Duchene is undervalued because most everybody agrees that he's a top 5 overall pick. We're going to shock some people here now and say that we think it's actually quite possible that Matt Duchene could move up. He in March was number 3 in Red Line Report's rankings. He could move up to number 2, possibly even to number 1. If Matt Duchene continues to push Brampton in the playoffs while John Tavares has a mediocre performance in London thus far, Matt Duchene's overall all-around game is really worthy of consideration up with the top 2 prospects, and that is, Victor Hedman and John Tavares, who've been up at 1-2 all season. But we are starting to think that, if Matt Duchene takes that team in Brampton much deeper into the playoffs, he's a guy who's going to actually start to receive consideration for the number 1 overall spot, or at least number 2. Moving on to the Quebec League, we think the least valued high top-end prospect in the entire draft this year is the backup goaltender in Montreal, Jean-François Berube. He's in the unenviable position of having to back up Jake Allen, who's probably the best goaltender in the queue and a real big-time prospect. But Berube only played about 15 games this season. Fortunately enough, we at Red Line Report were able to see 5 of those games, and we really like his composure, his poise. His body language is very good. He gives his teammates confidence. He's excellent side to side. We like his skills. His puck handling is a little weak at this point, so he's got to pick that up. But Berube is a guy who a lot of teams haven't really been able to see. Very few Chief scouts have seen him. He wasn't at the top prospects game. If Montreal doesn't go out in the first round of the playoffs, he won't even have a chance to compete at the World Under-18s in Fargo. So we don't know how much exposure he's going to get. A lot of Chief scouts around the league haven't had a chance to see him, but we think Berube is one of the really underrated sleepers in this year's draft. Continuing on, and we want to point out Sergei Ostapchuk, the Russian kid who's playing for Rouen-Noranda. We really liked Ostapchuk last year. We felt he was a third-round value, and he was completely overlooked. We found that surprising because he played on the Russian national under-18 team, second line, with guys like Andrei Laktionov and Dmitry Kugrashev, who were both relatively high draft picks in the NHL last year. Ostapchuk was the third member of that line, somewhat overlooked, but we didn't feel he was that far behind Kugrashev and Laktionov, and felt he should have been drafted last year. He's come over to North America this year, put up a very productive season with Rouen. averaging more than a point a game on a very mediocre club. And, he's just been carrying that team offensively the entire season. I think he's a guy who, on second chance this year, after getting more Northern American exposure, is going to probably go around the third, fourth round. But still, that might even be a little bit low for him. Move on to the third of the CHL leagues, the Western Hockey League. I think Cody Eakin out in Swift Current is a guy who's got first-round talent, but probably won't get picked there simply because of the fact that he's had some injury issues. He's been dinged up and banged up a little bit. He's a guy who's had 2 concussions in the past 2 seasons, which is going to concern some teams. Some teams won't touch guys who've had those concussion problems, especially once they recur. But Eakin is a guy who's got great speed and really knows where the net is. He can put the puck in, finds the back of the net with regularity. He's probably not going to go in the first round because of some of the concerns over the injuries, but he's certainly a first-round talent if healthy. Next up, I want to move on to a player in U.S. high school ranks, Nick Leddy, who's a smallish defenseman, plays for Eden Prairie High School out in Minnesota. We liken Nick Leddy to an Aaron Ness in last year's draft. He's only about 5'11", 175 pounds, smallish for a defenseman, but a tremendous puck mover with really good instincts and natural skills on the offensive end. Really thinks the game and sees the ice very well. Performed tremendously at the season-ending state high school championship tournament out in Minnesota, the very famous state high school championship tournament. We think Leddy has even got more upside than Ness, probably skates a little bit better than Aaron Ness did, and we think Leddy's stock should really be on the rise late in the season, but there hasn't been a whole lot of buzz about him to this point. Sticking in the U.S., there's a player in the U.S. junior ranks playing for the New Hampshire Monarchs, Brian Dumoulin. That's the New Hampshire Monarchs in the Eastern Junior League. Dumoulin is a guy who combines both good size at nearly 6'4" and 200 pounds with outstanding agility and lateral mobility. Can handle a puck and is the trigger man on the power play there with a big, heavy point shot. The Eastern Junior League is not one that's one of the leagues that's the more heavily scouted leagues, but Dumoulin has been consistently outstanding since early in the season. Really brought his game to another level after Christmas, from Christmas down through early March. I know a lot of teams went in specifically to see him, but we still think that he's a little bit undervalued. There's even an outside chance that some team might even step up and take him in the late first, early second round. But still, there hasn't been a whole lot of buzz about Dumoulin, and we think Dumoulin, again from the New Hampshire Monarchs in the Eastern Junior League, is going to be a surprise come draft day. And finally, we're going to wrap it up here this time out with a player from Russia, a big power winger named Anton Berdasov, who plays with Chelyabinsk over in Russia. For whatever reason, he has not gained the favor of the coaches on the national team, the national under-18 team, so he hasn't had a lot of international exposure at the major international tournaments. He did appear in Sweden back in February at the Five Nations tournament. We thought he had a very good outing, but from what we're hearing, he's not going to be included on the Russian under-18 team for Fargo at the World Under-18 Championships, which will deprive him of some really much-needed exposure and that last chance to really impress the scouts at what is the biggest season-ending international tournament of the bunch. And a very, very important tournament for final rankings. So we think that Berdasov is going to get shortchanged a little bit in terms of where he goes in this year's draft. First, by the virtue of the fact that he's Russian and they get downgraded to begin with. And second of all, because he's not going to get that last big exposure out in Fargo at the World Under-18s. But Berdasov is a guy who's got really good size at 6'3", almost 190 pounds, can handle the puck, shoots it very well, and cycles down low very well. Perhaps he doesn't have the greatest natural instincts. His hockey smarts are not upper echelon, but his physical tools and the way he performs down low in the offensive end stamps him as a guy who I think could be a second, third round value. That's it for this month's edition of the Red Line Report webcast, and we will see you again soon.